I'm Christa Daniels. I actually am the director of the Masters of Science program at Antioch University. I'm also a senior associate for the Center for Climate Preparedness and Community Resilience. And so I'm going to moderate and kick off this session for us. I'm not going to speak a lot. I also have laryngitis, which is from pneumonia from a while ago. I'm supposed to be on voice rest, so bear with me. I am not sick or contagious. It was bacterial, and it's from a long time ago. But my voice is not great. So I will try my hardest, and Sara Brock will probably pitch hit for me if I actually start squeaking. So it's great you guys are all here for the session on resilience and action, responding to intensifying storms. I told you about myself. If you want to hear more about our work with the center, you can go to communityresilience-center.org or find out about me on our website. But I'm going to just preface right now this session and kind of give the big picture so that we're kind of all on the same page. We're here to talk about disaster resilience, and I just wanted to make sure everybody was up to speed in terms of what we mean by disaster resilience. So when we're looking at disaster resilience, we're really looking at reducing vulnerability, right? And when we talk about vulnerability, we're really looking at three buckets. We're looking at exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And so exposure is the easy one to think about. That's the actual impact. What are we exposed to? Is it high heat days? Is it an ice storm? Is it sea level rise? Is it inland flooding? Is it wildfires? What is the actual impact, and can we reduce our exposure to that? Very, very hard to do, obviously. That'd be like managed retreat, just getting out of the way. Maybe a giant seawall for sea level rise. Not the easiest area to tackle with disaster resilience, I will say. I would say where we're mostly in for solutions is reducing sensitivity. And when we think about sensitivity, we're thinking about the degree the impact is affecting us, right? So how bad is that impact, and is it stopping us to have normal function, to do what we're supposed to be doing? So in the picture here, you can see both of these buildings are exposed to flooding, but one is less sensitive because they've built it higher. In terms of energy, maybe our power lines are under the ground and less sensitive to ice storms. So sensitivity is an area where there's a lot of disaster resilience work and solutions. It is mainly infrastructure, like hard solutions. The one area I'd like us all to keep in our minds moving forward is how do we deal with adaptive capacity? Because that is the other way to reduce our vulnerability. And that is something we want to increase. And think about adaptive capacity as that is kind of how an individual, a neighborhood, an organization, a community, a city or town, how can they withstand? How can they adapt? How can they live with the impact, yet they're still able to provide the same function? And in some cases, they're going to transform with that impact. They're going to, like the Danish, they're going to live with the water, and they're still going to function. And adaptive capacity really comes down to finance, education, tech, people. It's really the people side of things. And so when we think about this in terms of energy, right, we all talk about energy resilience, and we need energy resilience because energy resilience is how do we bounce back from an emergency, right? So there's an impact, and we want the power to come back quickly. So how quickly can we get back to normal, right? And I would say we need to be focusing, though, on also community resilience, which is more the area where we're thinking it's not just bouncing back. Obviously, we want to do that for health, safety, and welfare for people in our community or in our neighborhood, but it's also thinking about how can we still thrive with the impact? How can we continue, even if it means some types of transformation? And I would say in this area, there's a lot in terms of like social capital, which is community connections, and how do we have that in our lives to be able to build that part of the resilience? So you need both. But adaptive capacity is something that takes us forward. And so thinking about that, adaptive capacity, how do we bounce forward? What are the areas we need to be looking in, right, when we're thinking about resilience and solutions? Well, one is, what are our assets? There's 5 domains that really constitute this area of adaptive capacity. What are our assets? What can people draw upon in times of need? What about the flexibility to change different strategies? There's also this idea of organization, the ability to organize and act collectively together during an emergency. Learning to be able to respond and recognize changes that are happening. And then finally, agency. So the empowerment to actually determine what to change, what not to change, how to act. So, those 5 domains are areas we should always be thinking about when we're trying to increase our disaster resilience. And these are things such as, we're talking about it in the different sessions here, whether they're community green power jobs that are not just providing local energy, but also providing jobs and livable wages. It's local food markets that are not just providing sources for the mainstream community, but are also incentivizing for low income, right? Like SNAP benefits are like double. And then in the picture on the bottom left, it's that monitoring and checking in on your neighbors, right, during an emergency. Who's actually going around and making sure that folks that are seniors in your community have everything they need? Or people that don't speak English, who's checking on who? And we saw a lot of that happen in New England during Hurricane Irene. I think we're very lucky living where we do, where there is already a lot of social capital, but it's degrading, and so we want to make sure we're somehow elevating that. So before we move on, and so just keeping that in our minds as we're hearing from all the speakers in terms of solutions on things that we can do to reduce sensitivity to bounce back, but what are the other areas we should be focusing on to bounce forward, right? To have this new normal that's thriving. Because the crux of it is that many cities are not happy with the status quo. They don't want to just bounce back. Right now there's rising inequality, there's greenhouse gas emissions, there's degrading environments, cost of inflation. There's so much happening that many communities want to bounce forward. So when we're investing money, we need to be thinking about those other benefits and what we can do to help communities bounce forward with energy resilience. So the only thing I'll leave you with is I have a QR code here. Antioch has been working with the Tolosa Foundation and this organization called Polco that works with cities across the United States. And we do have a guidebook to measure community connections. It's free. It looks at the 5 dimensions, whether it's equity or placemaking or institutions, participation, social belonging, social engagement. So any town, city, organization can download this and look through it. It's online, and you can do it in paper and pencil, or you can do it online. It can be small, it can be large, like the whole community. And the people from Polco and Tolosa are also taking pilot communities right now for free if anybody thinks their community wants to try this out with the assistance for Antioch. So just something to be thinking about. So with that, I want to make sure we get to all our panelists. I'm introducing our first panelist, which is Paul Kasper, who is the director of the Division of Enforcement for the New Hampshire Department of Energy. And I think this is your first slide.
Good morning. I'm sorry. Good morning, everyone. And the reason I have this slide up, I know certainly not to insult anybody's intelligence, but Ben Franklin was a very resilient type person when you study him, and everybody attributes to the discovery of electricity because he flew a kite up into an electrical storm. He didn't discover what he was trying to prove is that there was a connection between lightning and electricity, and he was smart enough to use silk as the string because it was non-conductive. So he was a very bright guy. And when he brought the kite down, the reason he put the key on it, because the lightning energized, gave it a negative charge, the key, And when he brought it back down and he touched it, his hand was a positive charge. He got a shock, but that was the reason he did it. That was to prove. So and when you think about all of his other inventions, he was a pretty resilient guy. So let's see. So basic electrical system. And when we talk about resiliency, there's a lot of vulnerability here. And today there's even more, because what we've added to these systems, we have solar farms, we have wind turbines, systems, we have battery storage. So all of these things do have vulnerability. So how do we build resiliency into all of this? I think I get this right. So this, everybody knows what this is. You see them everywhere, right? Transmission right-of-ways and towers. So how do we build this type of a system of resiliency against? There are three high-impact things that can happen. We have man-made impact. We have war. We have terrorism. We have just, somebody that just wants to cause damage. And we have natural impact, Mother Nature. And we certainly have had a good lesson this year, right, when you think about the intensity of hurricanes now, and even snowstorms over the last couple of years, and how it proved to us we have to build resiliency. And it's being built. Technology is changing. It's gotten better. My own background, I'm not as old as Ben Franklin, but I've been in the utility industry most of my career. And it was, I've seen, it's really, I'm very grateful that I've gotten to see the improvements in technology. Distribution systems, these are the ones that really affect you the most. This is from transmission, you go to distribution voltage that feeds everybody's home, all the, workplaces. Vulnerability. How do we build, it's like, how do we build a better wheel? We've been building distribution systems the same way for a long time. Originally started, if you went back to Tom Edison and Tesla and all, they took a tree, stuck it in the ground, put wire on it. Well, we kind of refined that process, didn't we? And then there's underground. Yep, underground's great. It has great resiliency, except when it fails. Then it becomes difficult to locate and repair. So everything, there's a double-edged sword to a lot of things. But the key is, as we move along and we think of better ways. So some of the components that help with resiliency is SCADA systems. We finally figured out a way to use computers to help us better manage power flows. We have switches, not just, we had very old technology when it came to switches. And smart grids. That's a term that's been around for a very long time. And when you ask somebody, you ask anybody what a smart grid is, and you ask 25 people, you get 25 different definitions. So anyway, if we look at these are pretty much older technology. They were very manual. The cutout and disconnect, there's a piece of wire in the middle of that tube. And when there was a short circuit or an overload, it would burn the wire open and the bottom of the tube would fall down, and an overhead troubleman would be riding by, he'd be looking for a little tail. And he knew that there was an issue there. These types of switches are manual. Recloses and sectionalizes. Well, one of the things we've gone to, technology, is now we have smart switches. And through smart switches with outage management systems and SCADA systems that the utilities use, they can build intelligence into it and actually design it so it sees an outage. And today, utilities can probably take an outage that initially starts off with 6,000 people out and within 5 minutes put 4,000 back. So it's there. The momentum is there to build this type of resiliency into our energy that we need. But this is what happens. Here in New Hampshire, I'm sure you can tell, I'm not originally from New Hampshire just by my accent. We have 250-foot pine trees. And when they come down, they can do a lot of damage. But one of the improvements has been, the utilities have gone to using tree wire. At one time, conductors were bare, and we called it open wire, and it went pole to pole. Well, now they have like an insulation on them. In a lot of areas, sensitive areas, we put up steel poles. And not too long ago, the last storm that we had here in New Hampshire, there was a very critical right-of-way, distribution right-of-way, where a 200-foot pine tree came over, and it happened to go over a section that was between two steel poles. And when it came over, it laid across the tree wire between these two steel poles and didn't even cause an outage. So moving to the future, finding better ways. So, and basically, that's all I have.
Would you prefer this, Elli? That's okay. I think I'm going to stand a little bit just so I can see and everybody can see me. Can I take it out of this a lot easier? Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Elli Ntakou. I work for Eversource, and I am responsible for planning investments to improve reliability and resiliency of our grid. So I think my starting slides very well connect with what Paul just talked about. So just to set the stage, here in New England, utilities are not vertically integrated, so Eversource's responsibility is to own and operate the T&D wires, and we do not own generation. So I'll start here, and this is one of our KPIs. It's called SAIDI. It's a very well-known reliability metric. It shows the average interruption duration, and this is the performance for the past 10 years. So what you'll see here is essentially a step reduction in SAIDI starting 2019. You also have two horizontal lines here that talk about what's the IEEE benchmarking survey quartiles. So after 2019, Eversource New Hampshire was actually performing in the top quartile. And this is because of all of the investments that we made in our grid, all of the nice things that Paul talked about, that just reduced the SAIDI, reduced interruption duration is a good thing. So all of that's actually reflected in how our system operates nowadays. But what happens when we want to talk about these major storms? That metric takes out these major storms. It tries to show how the system operates on an average day, a good enough day, a storm that is expected to occur time and time again. So resiliency, we think about it as what happens when we have major events. And I'll go into more details of our methodology, but before that, I wanted to sort of show you how we think of the investments that we make in resiliency. So a first bucket, we call it our engineering standards. And this is sort of blanket improvements in our system because of our efforts to keep the grid at a minimum level and leave no part of the grid and no community behind. So when we go around and inspect our poles and find a pole to be leaning or otherwise needing replacement, or whether we replace a pole because it's taken down by one of the large trees here in New Hampshire during a storm, we still have the same standard on what to replace it with, what's the minimum level of resiliency we're building into our system across the board. what I'm going to talk in my next slides in a little bit more detail is how we actually go back into our data and find grid vulnerabilities that we have based on our outage and interruption data of the past few years. The other type of investment that we do is looking forward. So how do we expect these major storms to move in the future? How do we expect them to become more intense or more frequent, or generally the weather patterns changing and creating other storm events? So what can we do right now to proactively hedge against these hazards? And then stakeholder engagement, I think, ties back to the discussion, to the introduction of this panel session, and talks about, is there a solution that can kill two birds with one stone? For example, the city of Boston is very concerned about flooding, so they're bringing together stakeholders and trying to ask the question, is there a solution that would protect residential homes, Eversource's electric asset, government buildings, all at the same time? So as promised, I'll talk about how we go back, look at our data, target where to go and what to do. And here is a metric similar to what I showed you before. It's called all-in SAIDI, and the difference is that now we don't exclude any days. This is a 24/7 metric that has these major storms baked in. And you probably will notice the vertical axis increased by 2 orders of magnitude. So performance during these storms obviously is an interruption during the storms. The average is obviously larger. And because New Hampshire has gotten a lot of storms recently, you see how it performs in the bottom 50% of the IEEE survey. And so that metric we think is a good enough metric to start and baseline where we are, set and use it to understand how our mitigations help that metric improve, reduce that 24/7 outage interruption indicator. So we go back to our data, we find where we had interruptions, and the idea to do that cost efficiently is to say, we're going to break up these eligible zones for mitigations into 3 buckets based on how much they impacted our system. And the idea is to pair these buckets with a solution that's more effective and most expensive, hierarchically down. So tier 1 zones contributed a lot of customer minutes of interruption, so maybe zones that went out multiple times, maybe zones that impacted a lot of customers. They're there, and they get paired with undergrounding, obviously a very powerful mitigation that takes away all interaction with weather and vegetation. Reconductoring is something that we can do for other zones that are tier 2 or tier 3, whether we do aerial cable or we do bare to tree wire conversion. And vegetation management is another means of providing resiliency. So we found what to do. We paired our vulnerabilities with a mitigation. We have a second layer of cost efficiency. So what this shows you here is if we follow that process, went back to our data, and have mitigations for everything that's vulnerable enough, that would basically cost us $1.5 billion. That's what that horizontal axis tells you. But if you observe that curve that shows you the decline in that duration metric relative to how much we keep spending on the horizontal axis, you'll see we have, it shows you we have a good amount of low-hanging fruit, a good amount of zones that cost us relatively less to fix, but make a dent in that metric. And the idea here is to stop spending when that line flatlines, when there's no more benefit and for the dollars that we spend. And here you see we can spend about 10 times less, $150 million, and increase the cost efficiency of our program twofold. So that is the process where we say that's how we optimize our spending. This is the optimal way to structure our investment in resiliency in our New Hampshire grid. Is that enough? And the idea is, how do we justify that this is enough? When we have major storms, the data will show you did a good job. You should have invested. You invested, great job. When we don't have major storms, which is just patterns, weather patterns, and stochasticity of these weather patterns, we won't see that. Does that mean that investment wasn't good or it won't be useful in the future? No. So the idea here is to compare these costs with what are the benefits. And the benefits we consider are twofold. The first stream of benefits is the Eversource costs that are being reduced Obviously, this is great for the customer because these costs flow essentially to the customers at the very end. So what you see here is how we forecast our storm restoration process will evolve after we perform hardening. That's that blue line. That's essentially that red curve pushed down. So this reduced exposure and this adaptive capacity that we spoke of before, that is that reduction. That's what that shows. We have less customers out and we're restoring faster. And the second stream of benefits that we consider is the customer value of lost load cost. This is customer-sided costs. And we use the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs ICE calculator, which is a very common way to calculate these costs. So the idea is to compare costs and benefits and try to understand if there's a positive relationship here to make that resiliency investment. So that's it from me. I hope I did okay on time, and happy to take any questions later. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Sankowich. I'm the Director of Sustainability and Shared Services at Unitil. We serve electric and gas in the New England states. I don't have any slides because mine is a little bit less technical than what we've just heard. It's more strategic and thinking about the future. So there's really three main ways that Unitil thinks about resiliency and preparing for the future. The first is looking at how we can prepare for what's coming. And in order to do that, we have to understand what the future might look like with climate change. So to do that, we've looked at different models and scenario analysis and looked at some of the worst cases, some of the most positive cases with climate change, and figured out what is actually a physical threat to our system and how we might react to that threat. So Unitil has some substations and some gas lines near the ocean. So are rising sea levels going to be a problem? Coastal storm surge, is that going to cause us problems? So we actually had people come in, gather all of that data, model it over our system, and find out where the substations were that might be causing us a problem. So when we invest in those substations due to natural investment needs, we are preparing for what a future 50, 80 years in advance might look like. And that's going to save money in the long run. So we looked at weather extremes, sea level rise, changes in precipitation. This year we're looking at wildfire, things that we never thought we'd have to think about in this region. But how are we prepared for what this future may look like? So once we figure out what the future looks like, how do we harden our system to be resilient to that? That's the next question. So in my scope of things, I also manage the vegetation management program, and that was one of the pieces that Elli talked about to help harden your system. So one of the things that we reacted to right away was the increasing frequency and damaging storms that are coming our way, hurricanes, violent thunderstorms, wind. And we created a storm resiliency program that focused on vegetation management. And we looked at the critical pieces that Paul talked about, from the substation out to those first protective devices, where a lot of the critical infrastructure for a community is served. Shelters, police, fire, hospitals, things like a grocery store, a restaurant, a gas station. A lot of those things are served off of critical portions of your line. If you can harden those areas and keep that running, then if there's a big event, there's a safe place for people to go, warmth, food, comfort, and we can get the rest of our distribution lines up and running more quickly so people can be back into their homes. So that's what we focused on. And by looking at the vegetation very critically, 360 review of all of the trees and what's going to potentially fall, including health of tree scans, lots of training for all of our arborists in the field, we're trying to predict which trees we think would fail. And then working with the communities to make sure that the trees that are left behind are kept healthy and taken care of. Right? And so if we have to remove a tree, we want to replace it with a low-growing tree that's not going to be impacting the vegetation or the wires in the future, coexistence of trees and wires. So that's vegetation management. There's a lot of other strategies of connecting lines together so that if one area goes down, you can feed from another area. There's tons of electrical infrastructure type strategies in order to harden if you pinpoint areas that are going to be a problem, flooding, access, things like that. You can design strategies to be resilient if those things go down. So the first step is knowing what might be a problem. And lastly, it's our third piece is improving resiliency for our customers at the customer level. Everything we've talked about so far is our own assets that we own. And the last piece would be, how can our customers withstand an event a little bit longer so that the time that it takes for us to get, the service to their house, they can bridge that gap. And one of the things we looked at this summer with a UNH sustainability fellow was the possibility of having battery energy storage systems at customers' houses. And if you couple that with solar, then we have clean energy that can be used for customers. And so the battery energy storage program, what that would be customers would have an energy storage device at their own homes, and they could charge the battery during times of low demand when electricity is cheaper, and then the battery could discharge into the system in times of need when power is high, when costs are high. That would reduce our peak demand. So there's a lot of really great benefits to the system beside resiliency to having customers having distributed battery resources. If we had enough of those, we could pool them together, and it would be a virtual power plant that we could turn off and on for clean energy to really eliminate some of those peaks in our system. So not only are we having resiliency to customers where if there's a storm coming, they can make sure their battery's charged and then run off the battery for a few hours and run the essentials that you have without having to have a whole house generator, but we're also preparing ourselves for that clean energy future where we can leverage individual storage areas at people's homes to be a power source, right? So that's one of the things we were focusing on. There's a lot of challenges because of cost right now, and how would this be cost effective for customers? And our energy system really needs to change and evolve and think about the future if we're going to effectively help incentivize customers to do that. So one of the things that would lead the way for making this possible would be the ability for Unitil and other energy companies to do transactive energy, meaning that you get paid to be off the grid. So if you're like, yes, I opt into this, and Unitil says, hey, we need your virtual power plant battery today, you could say, great, have at it, take all that energy that I stored, and Unitil will pay you some money to do that, right? We don't do that now, so just so you're not like, I want to sign up for that today. That's something we're looking at in the future, but in order to do that, you really need to have all of these systems in your company talking to each other. The financial system has to marry with the load. You have to have smart meters and all these things to be able to tell whether or not you're off the grid, all of these tools talking together. So there is a lot that we have to do to get there, but that's what we're looking at. We really want to be a solution for the future and come together while we're improving resiliency. We're also improving the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and improving the amount of green energy that's on the system. So there's people working towards that. We're hoping that, regulatory-wise, we get approval, because the best thing would be if we could have it like energy efficiency programs, where you can have the cost of that system put on your bill, so like on-bill tariff. And then we could equitably roll that out, because you don't need a large amount of capital to go and buy your $10,000 battery system, right? And it's not a lease where you have to pay continually over time and you don't realize those returns. So we are fortunate in New Hampshire that could be a possibility, but it hasn't been explored, and obviously has to go through the whole legislative process before utilities could roll that out. But there are lots of great people from all the utility companies working together on this, not just Unitil. There's a whole bunch of people and the Office of Consumer Advocates working on thinking about what transactive energy and integrated energy planning looks like to help make communities more resilient.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. And now for Sara.
I'm the Sara with the H, so no judgment on which is better. Thank you for the transition. That was very convenient. I am the oddball in the room in that I do not work for a utility. I'm at Clean Energy New Hampshire, which is your host for today. And I run who has the clicker? Thank you. I run our Circuit Rider program, but I'm going to skip right by this because most of you know who we are. But we have a team that is my team that provides direct, free technical assistance to municipalities, small businesses, and agricultural producers around the state. And this is us. That's us on the electric school bus. I hope some of you got to see the electric school bus earlier today. We have staff around the state. These are our 4 municipal circuit riders. We are grant funded by local and federal grants. And so Melissa and Katrin and Doug and Frank live in those communities, and they are like a traveling adjunct staffer to all the tiny little municipalities who are trying to do energy projects and don't otherwise have the capacity to identify, prioritize, find the contractors, write the grants. We do a little bit of everything to help get projects done, and that's our bottom line. We're pretty vendor agnostic, technology agnostic, as long as it's something in the efficiency, clean energy, and electrification space. And we, in some communities, do everything on this list, and in other communities, we just try to plug in when we can help nudge things along. And we have a portfolio of projects that we're tracking and supporting that's pretty broad. A lot of solar, a lot of efficiency, and the reason that I was invited to come here and talk about resilience today is that we're starting to dip into this battery energy storage space, which feels a little bit left field for us, but not really. I'm going to let us watch something for a moment, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing and why. Bear with me. This is not New Hampshire. So that's what I would love in New Hampshire. It's kind of hard to argue with that. This is Louisiana, but this isn't so far from what we could see. So Melissa, she is our North Country circuit rider. She worked for 3 years to bring solar to this little elementary school in northern New Hampshire. And the week that she was going up to do the ribbon cutting, she happened to learn that they had just approved $75,000 to buy a new diesel generator to back up that facility. And the timing clicked for her, and she just went, wow. There was no other option for them, and this is their emergency shelter in their community, and of course they're going to replace their generator, but they just spent so long trying to put solar up. Isn't there something else we can offer them? And that just stuck with her. We then learned that the U.S. Department of Energy was running a Energizing Rural America's Prize or something to that effect. And she read the description. There's been these prize awards as part of the national stimulus, and we've been fortunate enough to receive a few of them. But she thought, this idea of figuring out how to do battery energy storage at emergency shelters in rural New Hampshire might be something we could get some money for and try, because we weren't aware of any facilities that were being used in that way having energy storage. So we went after the money, we got the money, and we were finding ourselves having to suddenly become experts in battery energy storage, which we know nothing about. So we called Kim Quirk, thank you, Kim, and a few of our other partners and our colleagues at Eversource and others. And we just started asking communities whether they were interested and what their concerns were about battery storage and energy backup when the grid goes down. And we started hearing stories, and some of them we expected, some of them we didn't. I mentioned the example of the elementary school in northern New Hampshire that went through the process of having solar. We did find communities that had already installed solar and therefore kind of liked the idea of going that step further and then having battery storage instead of diesel be their on-site backup. We also, and I think we heard this more often, we went to an energy committee and we sort of pitched this idea and just were listening to their reaction. And they said, you know, it's funny you say that because this week we were at our select board meeting and we learned that our generator hadn't been touched in 6 months and it's just not working. And the town is kind of freaked out about that. I mean, if you know generators, you have to maintain them and run them periodically. And these are tiny towns, and it had just been overlooked. So the idea of having a battery as another layer of assurance that that facility was going to be there if the grid went down was appealing to them. We also had another community that just this past winter, on Christmas Day, 4 days into an outage, their generator failed at their emergency shelter, and everyone went into a panic. And so when we went to talk to them, they similarly said, yeah, we would love to have another layer of resiliency, and we are looking at solar on these buildings as well. So we got more traction than we expected. We started developing, and I'll show you the list again, a relatively big list of towns that we had talked to and were interested at some level, but these are complex projects. They're also very expensive projects. So that's when we started working with Eversource, and I didn't talk much about this. I assume I'm in a pretty tech-savvy room, but if you haven't already, that some of this is obvious, but there are a lot of benefits to looking at battery as electric backup. We started working with a lot of partners, and Eversource was great. It turns out, and you can say, stop talking if I overspeak at any point here, Jen. Jen's my Eversource partner. But they have this clean energy fund, and some of the C&I money that had been set aside for batteries in the C&I space was underutilized, and they learned that we were having all these conversations with municipalities and that there was some interest. And they pivoted and said, well, we could repurpose some of these funds, and they were able to allocate $1 million and get approval for that to be set aside for municipal energy storage at emergency shelters. And so we have been, since that came through, working with some of these communities, trying to figure out who's ready to be the first couple to work out the kinks and figure out who are the contractors and how can this work, and can we put together a model to show other communities what this could look like. And we're right in the thick of that right now. What we're doing for folks, Eversource has come through and said we can cover 50% of the projects all in, which is significant for these towns. We also, if you work in the municipal space, you know that the Inflation Reduction Act came with something called elective pay, often called direct pay, which is game-changing because it means that municipalities and nonprofits, people without a tax appetite, can take the IRS tax credits for clean energy, and that includes battery storage. So we're going to be able to get them halfway there with Eversource, and then another 30% with tax credits, hopefully. And then Eversource has also got a low-interest financing program, and there's a couple other programs we think can get them to that 100%. And suddenly we can go to these select boards and say, this is a little left field, no one's done this before, but here's the benefits, and we think we can help you pay for it. So we've got a handful of towns that are going to be out in front. They are all sprinting toward town meeting, and if any of you have tried to put a project through your local town meeting process, it starts like yesterday. You have to have all of the project details together and language to put before your voters by the end of December in order for that to be prepared for your March town meeting. So right now we've got towns going back and forth with contractors and trying to get that language final so that they can start educating voters and hopefully get voters to approve whatever they would need to approve to have the money to go through this project. But we're hopeful that a year from now, I'll be back and talking about how we've got these couple of case studies of emergency shelters that have battery backup, either alone or in conjunction with existing generators. And I would also say that the final use case has been communities that are in response to seeing more issues are developing emergency shelters for the first time. We still have a lot of communities that just don't have anything like that set up and don't have generators on community buildings. And the idea that they might be able to skip the diesel entirely and get by with something that's clean and easier to maintain is attractive to them. So I think I just wanted to give you that example, but I'm happy to take questions, and I'll hand it back over to Christa.
Thank you, Sara. So we tried to keep a lot of room today so that we could have more of a discussion in here. And so we'll have this mic going around. Carolyn might be helping me get to you since it's being recorded with the mics. And now's the time to ask anybody questions. So you can go first if you can use this, and then.
Extremely relevant to so many things that you have been talking about. My name is Lisa Sieverts. I'm the chair of the Clean Energy Nelson Committee. We're not an official town committee. Nelson, little town in the Monadnock region, population about 700. We've actually had 3 solar projects successful in our town. First one 10 years ago, so we have decent amount of solar right now. I want to give a big shout out to the Circuit Rider program. We worked with John Condos on some heavy duty grants that we did not get, but by working on the grant, we built a lot of capacity and also some wording that we can reuse. And now working closely with Frank Richter on exactly the battery storage project. So, for example, we were 13 days without power in the 2008-2009 ice storm. 13 days. Didn't get power back until the day before Christmas. 20 degrees below zero during that week. That was a heck of a power outage for us, and we get regular power outages. So just shout out for all of that. But I also want to take us in a little bit of a different direction because I'm really interested in the people in our towns. You talked about stakeholder engagement. I've been really interested in a topic recently called mutual aid. In my area, it's a little confusing because in Cheshire County, mutual aid is how all the emergency dispatchers talk to each other. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a more general concept of people helping people. You see it happen by the grassroots in disasters. I mean, it's happening in North Carolina right now, happened with Hurricane Sandy. But what could we build before the disaster so that we have ways of communicating, we have ways of leveraging volunteers immediately, we have ways of getting the food, the medical equipment, the stuff we need during a disaster, that we don't wait until the disaster has happened and now it's a crisis, and people are amazing in a crisis, but what could we build in advance? And are there ways that the utilities, not as the only source, but are there ways that you all could help us? So I'm just curious, it's sort of a general question. So I'd like to focus on this mutual aid question. Is there anything that you see, any of the 5 of you, happening already in New Hampshire or other models that we should be looking at?
I'll start with that answer. So from a utility perspective, mutual aid means that we are taking our resources like our line crews and our trucks and people, and we bring them to an area that needs assistance. So we would drive our vehicles over, even if it was Eversource or the co-op or wherever, and we would help restore power in those situations. So that's what we look at from a mutual aid perspective. And there are lots of organizations that coordinate mutual aid, in New England and outside of New England, that talk to each other, that say how many resources that there are by which utilities where, and they coordinate where they go, and that way you can plan for lodging and meals and all. There's tons of logistics that go in the background of mutual aid. So the utilities are very good at that, sending mutual aid, like down for the hurricanes that just happened. We sent lots of crews from New Hampshire down there for mutual aid. As far as in addition to just getting resources up and running, the government has some programs for mutual aid with the National Guard and other things like that. But there are people thinking outside of the box. Unitil has sponsored the Social Innovation Challenge at UNH in the past, and I got to be a judge going there and listening to these great student ideas. And one of the ideas that a student had was an app or a type of communication tool that municipalities could download, and then they could put right in there what they need. Like, I need food, water, medical, whatever it is, and then that would talk amongst New Hampshire and surrounding states, identifying what kinds of needs you had. And then, say, the coast got hit and somewhere farther in the west didn't, they could say, oh, well, we can send some resources over. We have emergency, medical assistance or whatever. So there are people thinking outside the box, but it's sort of like what's going to catch on and be useful. Is there something that we can implement as a state that might really be helpful? So having this conversation is great. Maybe as a state we can come up with a tool that's used between all of the communities to coordinate resources.
I think your discussion is very interesting. But there's an assumption that gets made that everything works during a disaster. What if it doesn't? So in order to put forward what you're proposing is you have to really create a model for your town, your area, your community, and it actually has to be practiced. Because when you think about recently the devastating hurricanes in Florida and into the Carolinas, what happened? People didn't have cell phones. There was no way for a lot of them to communicate. And then, almost by natural way of one human being to another, they daisy-chained. So I think that's something that has to get developed in a real specific way for each community.
Thanks, Paul. I will just add, looking at it from a national perspective, that there are a lot of resiliency hubs out there in this country now, and a lot of them are trying to transition from being reactive to being proactive, to exactly what you're talking about. So that was an example of a resilience hub that Sara shared, and there's some really pretty robust ones in Baltimore, Maryland, and in Charlotte, and a few other places. And what they're doing is they're trying to switch from being a place that people can go to during a disaster to doing exactly what you're saying. So how can they be a resource and setting up those monitor chains? And most of them are getting funding through private-public partnerships. So they are being run by the city or the regional planning agency or the council of governments. So it's being run by the actual institution of government. However, some of them are being funded by the utilities and by the state and by the federal government. And so there's a couple examples we can get on the website for you to take a look at that I think get to what you're talking about, to set up that kind of resilience hub that is proactive and reactive. Next question, I saw one over there.
I'm actually not going to use the microphone. Can anyone hear me? I'm loud as it is, and you'll all be deaf by the time I'm going to hand that back to you. Thank you. My name is Nick LaRoche. I'm with Walden Mutual Bank. If you hadn't heard from us, today's the first day in here. I've been tasked with very mission-driven bank, food systems, agriculture, farming, and renewable energy. I've been tasked with the renewable energy piece of this. And I've been learning a lot over the last 3 months since I joined the bank. But I want to actually bring you back 20
You're correct about if it could go underground, but you have to realize exactly where we are. New England is, we're in the granite state. Just to give you an example, I don't know if you've ever been to Miller State Park. There was a line that goes up to the top of Monadnock there, and it feeds all of the communication towers up there. And it came to everybody's attention that it had to be rebuilt. And the community out there were a very strong community because everybody has love of Miller State Park out there. And they wanted to put it underground. Well, just looking at that, just on the surface, between Eversource and the state, my group, and we talked to, I believe, it was White Mountain Power. They had actually brought the power up with the cog railway going up Mount Washington. So, of course, they attached it to the rail, which is easy because it's on the surface. But to put that underground going up to the top of Miller State Park there, that would have been the big dig of New Hampshire. And to give Eversource its due, they were a good community partner. At the top, they put things underground, the very top, and made it a much better looking system. Most towns in New Hampshire today, any new developments, they do require to put what they call URD, underground, distribution systems. But to put everything underground would be very expensive, obviously. And underground has its issues too. Like I said earlier, overhead you see it falls down, they know where it is, they can, we come by, put it back up. Underground, when it fails, then it's, you're looking at doing an analysis of where did it fail. Yep, you can do some creative switching with underground also, like you can with overhead. I guess one of the suggestions would be to say you take distribution circuits and you kind of make them a little bit smaller, more compact, so that when one area goes out, you can use another area to help feed that. Similar idea of using solar as a backup and battery. There's a lot of creative things. It's just pushing that ball forward. You're right. I read a lot about Disney, Walt Disney was another creative guy. He was going to be he was going to be independent of everything, and he certainly made Disney World that way. So I guess towns probably in the community and the state itself has to really look at that. I don't know if that answered or helped or hindered your, Yeah. You know what's interesting about New Hampshire also? You either hit ledge or sand. It's just amazing. You can absolutely look like you're digging in a beach, and about 6 inches to the right or left, it's solid ledge. That's why just putting gas lines in New Hampshire, that's a very expensive proposition to do because of that, So, anyway.
Just real quickly to add to that, the utility companies do evaluate the possibility of putting lines underground. And, with any of the storm hardening programs that we have, we evaluate the cost, which may be significantly high depending on where it is, but in other areas it might not be as high, and the benefit might be really big. So we have done strategic undergrounding in certain locations. But as far as putting it all underground, it's difficult to transition an existing system from overhead to underground. There's a lot of problems with that logistically, and so that's why it's a lot easier to design and implement a brand new system underground, like for those developments. But it is something that I'm sure Eversource looks at as well.
Perfect. I'm going to come to, I think you were first and you're second. And I would just preface that some of the biggest progress in resilience is coming out of the Stockholm Resilience Center overseas. And just one thing to think about when they're looking at resilience, they're looking at modularity and redundancy. And so places like New England, where you can't put lines completely underground, some of the things that Sara was talking about before in terms of backup battery and the legislation we need to do microgrids is going to be a real winner for us in terms of creating that modularity and redundancy so that when the power does go out, it doesn't go out everywhere. And a few of you here I know can talk about that. So hold on.
Hi, I'm Dory Drachman. I live in Peterborough and am active in the Monadnock region through the Monadnock Sustainability Hub. And I have two questions. One's very quick, or I think it is. You never know. And that's for Sara with the H, about that last piece of the cost after you get the grant and then elective pay. How much is left over for the town to absorb?
The current pilot will be 20%. And just to give you a rough sense of scale, on the lower end, like a tiny little municipal building, it's somewhat residential in scale. We're talking like 60,000, 80,000, all the way up to over 100,000, all the way up to over 200,000 for a big community facility. And I am not an installer or an expert, but that gives you just rough scale.
Yeah,
but the 20%
helpful.
is what we're trying to cover.
Okay, great. Thank you. So my bigger question kind of piggybacks a bit on what you were just talking about, Christa. And hearing the battery solutions, I am part of the Monadnock Sustainability Hub, so that kind of technology is definitely appealing. And I kind of see the resiliency hubs with that battery backup and then the more distributed battery systems as being like first cut for resilience, second cut for resilience. And with the one that's just for the Resiliency Center, I see a lot of agency within the towns to be able to make that happen. With the more distributed, the distributed battery program, we have much less agency. And so we are really dependent on the utilities to help us make that happen. And so I guess my questions are, first of all, how far away are we from this? I know like in Vermont, they've had that for years, and it has definitely helped them, keep their costs lower during, high heat, peaker plant necessity, being able to eliminate that in, very high temperatures. How close are we? And especially for Eversource, because most of New Hampshire is dependent on Eversource. And if we're not that close, what can communities do to help push? So those are my questions.
This is not my field of expertise, but would it help? Obviously, it would. When we're talking about, and it's a question of how distributed it should go. I'm an engineer, so I'm going to take it to a technical direction. But we as Eversource have experience with battery-based microgrids. We have a very large microgrid in Provincetown in Cape Cod, right? And the idea of, well, if we have an interruption, the battery kicks in and feeds the community. Yes, it does. Is that easy? No, it's not, right? So when we have an interruption, we're still supposed to go and fix the wires to repower and let the battery recharge. So, for example, in one of our 2023 events after a major storm, we were feeding the community with the battery. We were trying to synchronize after we restored, and it took us a while, right? So microgrids are very complicated. So if we talk about, let's have each home with its own individual battery wall and solar, that's kind of easier. If we talk about a community microgrid that powers multiple homes, those solutions are very complicated. Those solutions are, maybe more amenable for the utility because they operate it, control it, own it, without very advanced monitoring and infrastructure systems. Individual homes, distributed resources are hard to rely on without control from the utility.
Well, in Vermont, I know the utility owns the battery, and they let homes use it unless the utility needs it for something.
Green Mountain Power has two solutions. They have a lease version, and then they have bring your own battery solution, where you get incentivized to have a battery. So there is the possibility that it's a owned piece, but they do have their own infrastructure like tool to manage when it's charged and when the grid comes in. So when you say how far away are we for just straight up battery, we're not far. That could happen very soon. People are doing that already. It's happening in with Liberty. Eversource actually has a program where you can apply to do a battery right now. So if you're an Eversource customer, you can go ahead over there. Unitil, we don't have a program yet, but we're looking at it. So that piece of it isn't too far away. There's technology out there. The piece that's hard is to make it cost effective, right? Without an Eversource rebate for one of these things, it's very expensive. To equitably get it to people across the state is hard. And the way that we would get the most use out of it is doing that transactive energy where you get paid to go off the grid. And that's what's really hard right now because we don't have that set up and there's definitely no legislature. So the actual batteries themselves, not so hard, but it's a limited population that's really going to think that they want it and pay for it. But there are programs available to customers right now for that. The widespread scalability of that technology to be useful as a virtual power plant and to really, save the customers a lot of money to make it very attractive for customers to do, that's a little bit trickier.
I think there's a little bit of a word of caution, too. This technology is great, but as you brought up, the ice storm of 2008, that happened again. All of these battery systems, a lot of that will deplete itself without being regenerated. So there is also the battery, like having a home generator. As we brought up here, it's expensive because it has to disconnect itself during an outage. It can't backfeed the system if it's out. There's a lot of, so when we say it becomes a little expensive right now, it is. Because of that, you have to have all of these safety features built into it. I guess I'm a big proponent of, let's create a better wheel. Make our infrastructure more resilient. We got to come up with better ways. Like I said, we started with putting a tree in the ground and putting a piece of, we actually used telegraph wire, right? That was the original ones that went up, going back in the 1800s. We kind of still do it the same way, maybe just a little more sophisticated, that's all. So we got to come up with a better way to that. Yeah, we can keep it up in the air, but we got to come up with maybe better material that can, that can take an 85-mile-an-hour wind that we had not long ago. So we have to think, I think myself, that's how I think. I'd like to see that.
All right, sorry for going over. One last question.
Okay, I'll make this quick. Ben Steele from Hanover. So the cost of batteries for backup is quite high, but there's actually tens of thousands of batteries out there in people's cars that could do this. And I know that the technology is available to feed the grid with vehicle-to-grid chargers, and I think there's a pilot program in Plymouth that might be Unitil's or the co-op. Okay. But also, has anybody been thinking about using that battery storage that sits all over the place, and there's going to be more and more of them, to power during outages?
Ready?
Absolutely, that's something we were looking at too, right? So I own a Ford Lightning, and I can power my house from it. So certain vehicles are looking at that. And so what is the potential for, vehicle adding resiliency, to people's homes? I think it's very high. I mean, you have a vehicle that can get you through that window of interruption, and then the grid gets restored. You can recharge your vehicle. It's a combination of what you're talking about of resiliency, right? We need those interruptions to be manageable with the tools that we have, whether it's a Powerwall, whether it's a, any other battery, a car. But there are potential tools out there that could bridge that gap. But we still need the infrastructure at the end, and we still need to make sure that that infrastructure can be restored in a timely manner so that our communities are safe and resilient.
Great. Well, is everybody done? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you to all our panelists for coming today and speaking to everybody, and for everybody staying an extra 3 minutes. So, thank you.